So I'm honored to be able to come up here and introduce Maria Ibarra. She is the Southwest Michigan Regional Organizer for We the People Michigan. She immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico when she was 9 years old and grew up in Southwest Detroit in Dearborn. Maria has been fighting for immigrant justice for almost a decade, including grassroots organizing and political advocacy. She works closely with grassroots organizations to create alternative systems of immigrant-centered support and working to put people of color and women in positions of leadership. Maria graduated from the University of Detroit Mercy with a degree in English and then went on to get a Master's of Social Work at the University of Michigan. Please give a warm welcome to Maria Ibarra.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting. I drove from Ypsilanti today, and although it was a little bit dreary, it was exciting to be here with so many social workers. I want to start today on this Day of the Dead, by honoring our ancestors. I want to honor the ones who didn't make it, the ones who perished on our borders in the heat and blisters of the desert, the victims of the terrorist attack on Sunday, and the young man who was killed on Tuesday in Detroit as he was canvassing. I also want to honor that we're standing on indigenous land of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. I don't know if any of you are having this experience right now, but I just want to name that I never saw myself up here. I never saw myself as a social worker or an activist, and I sure as hell didn't see myself as an organizer. But I guess that's why this is important, because if I, a shy, nerdy introvert who was too nervous to raise her hand in class, can be up here, or can be on the ground organizing, then maybe others can too. Maybe transformation is possible. Maybe we can do this. About a year and a half ago, I was sitting in my office of a previous job, and I got a phone call. It was from a woman named Lourdes Salazar. I picked up the phone and she said, "I'm being deported in 3 months. Somebody told me you could help." I had never met Lourdes. I had heard of her in the past and I knew that she had an immigration case, but that's it. And to this day, I still have no idea how she got my phone number. So as I was sitting with her in silence, all I could think about was my mom and how I would want someone to respond to her. And I thought about when my mom, my brother, and I first moved to the US from Mexico when I was 9 years old. My brother and I learned English much faster than her. So she often relied on me as the oldest to interpret for our family. I remember being 11 years old and interpreting doctor's letters and legal records, and sometimes being so afraid that I wasn't quite getting the translation right because so much depended on it. I remember being loaned out as the interpreter for my family and family friends, making phone calls to schedule appointments, and wondering if there were kids in other places who also had the same responsibilities I did. But I didn't mind. I was proud to be able to help my family, because this is who we were. We took care of each other. We took care of each other when a family friend was deported, and we all sat in his wife's living room crying, thinking of ways to keep them safe. We took care of each other after the election in 2016, when I was at the University of Michigan, and I called a meeting for undocumented students. And we sat in the basement of a university office eating pizza, talking about our backup plans in case DACA was rescinded, but also about how we would fight back. Because sometimes it feels like most of my life I've been fighting back. So when Lourdes asked me to help her, I knew what I had to do. I would fight for her and for her family, but also for my own family. But I wouldn't just stop there. Because all of a sudden, it wasn't just about immigration, and it wasn't just about me being a social worker or being an ally. It was about being a co-conspirator in this work, about shifting my relationship to the movement and my personal responsibility as a social worker. As I shared, I was born in Mexico. This is a church that's around the street from where my family lived. I had the privilege of going back to Mexico in the summer of 2016. During this time, DACA recipients could still apply for permission to travel abroad for educational purposes. And of course, I took my opportunity to visit Mexico after 17 years of not being there. And this is me as a baby in Mexico. My mom laughs that I started walking when I was 9 months old and I fell, and I didn't try again until I was 1. It's a good reminder to be patient and that things take the time they take. When I was 5 years old, my dad moved to the US, and I've never really had a conversation with him about why he decided to cross the border. But I can only imagine that it was a really difficult decision. No one leaves their homeland without documentation unless they're being chased out, unless they're searching for something better, something safer. I do remember, though, moving around a lot in Mexico, always moving our whole family into a single-bedroom house. My mom, my brother, and I lived in Mexico without my dad for over 3 years. And finally, when I was 9 years old, we were granted a miracle. My mom's tourist visa was approved. And we had the opportunity to come to the US. And once we were here, we overstayed. It was a choice between separating a family and going back to an ongoing struggle, or staying together in the US. In the past 2 years, there's been a lot of rhetoric about how dreamers or undocumented young people are paying for the crimes of their parents, about how we had no voice in deciding to come to the US. People who promote these messages are misguided. They're trying to use undocumented young people as political pawns. My parents made a courageous and incredibly hard decision in bringing my brother and I to the United States. And every day, I'm grateful for the sacrifices they made. I'm here because of them. Growing up as undocumented wasn't easy. Even in the US, we often move around, mostly between Detroit and Dearborn. But unlike now, there wasn't an immigrant youth movement. No one talked about being undocumented. In fact, it was a dirty family secret. It wasn't until I was 19 that I was able to share with someone else that I was undocumented. One of the hardest parts was navigating everyday tasks, like getting to work or enrolling in school. Undocumented people in Michigan aren't eligible for driver's licenses or IDs. So as my friends were getting their licenses and driving themselves to school, I had to pretend that I wasn't interested in getting mine, and I didn't want to learn how to drive. As my peers were applying to the dream colleges, I was carefully sifting through each application and compiling a list that didn't require a social security number to enroll. That's how I made it through college. And maybe that's how I developed my love with spreadsheets. My college process became a list of spreadsheets that compared expenses versus scholarships, and then picking the one that was most affordable. Yet I was lucky. I had the support from my parents that provided for me and encouraged me. They're the original dreamers. I'm just a product of their hope. But this isn't to say that it wasn't hard to be an undocumented college student. I worked all throughout college, often working about 30 hours a week on top of a full course load. Like many undocumented students, I placed this unrealistic expectation on myself that I had to work harder than all my peers, that it wasn't enough to be in college. Somehow, I had to show the world that I really, really deserved this opportunity, and I wasn't going to waste it. This is common among many undocumented people, the expectation that we have to be extraordinary in order to receive basic human rights. Somehow, among the hecticness of college, I ended up in an immigrant rights training in 2009. I was a sophomore and I was feeling particularly helpless. Even if I got my college degree, I wouldn't be able to work. So when I was invited to an immigrant rights training in Ann Arbor, I said yes because I had nothing to lose, and because I was tired of feeling powerless. I've always called myself an accidental organizer. I am not a people person. I'm a shy introvert who gets overwhelmed easily. My parents joke around that I'm the antisocial social worker. But something changed in me when I attended this training. For the first time in my life, I was around people who understood. I didn't have to explain why I didn't have a license or traveled abroad, or even consider doing things like going out for a drink because it might require an ID. In this training, I found my story. And within my story, I found my power. There's something beautiful and powerful about owning your own identity, about saying, I will not be erased, I will not be shamed, I will no longer hide. This was in 2009, and our big fight was around the DREAM Act, a piece of legislation that would have granted citizenship to undocumented young people brought to the US as children. The DREAM Act has had several iterations since then. each one being more divisive than the other. But at this time, I didn't quite fully understand the impact of our work. I felt a false sense of liberation. I felt like I could probably be myself without being afraid, without shame, and I felt like I had a group of people backing me up. But our messaging was wrong. This was my first introduction to the idea of allyhood. Allies were US citizens and people with permanent protection who could navigate the world with a level of safety and permanency that I didn't have. And I and other young people relied heavily on our allies. They offered us rides, picked up food, printed off supplies, and yes, often spoke on our behalf. I saw them with a sort of reverence, grateful for their presence, but always feeling indebted. I remember there was a woman who lived near me, and I would have to text her for a ride to go to our meetings every week because I didn't have a license or a car, and I always felt guilty. And it never stood out to me that she never willingly offered to pick me up, even though she lived along the way. I felt like they were doing me a favor. Every once in a while, an ally would have a story about how her friend, her partner, parent was undocumented, and that's why she was doing this work. But there was always a power imbalance. They had a resource or a connection that I needed, and I had nothing to give in return. Occasionally, I would do an interview or two to help someone with their research, but it was a very transactional relationship. While I was doing this work and studying social work in undergrad, I often found myself trying to understand how I could be both the social worker and the client. Because the reality was that under many circumstances, I would be the type of client many social workers would encounter. Low income, undocumented, living in Detroit. I was orbiting this confusing space where the line between an ally, a colleague, a service provider were often mixed. At the same time, we kept organizing and trying to move to pass the DREAM Act. I found myself sharing messages that now I truly regret. Because I was in college and I spoke English and I had a clean record, I found myself as a poster child for immigration. Somehow, through our own doing and through some bad strategic choices in the movement, we found ourselves perpetuating the notion of the deserving immigrant. We would say things like, I'm not a criminal, I don't deserve to be deported, I've earned the right to live here, I'm American in every sense. We were unwillingly and unknowingly putting communities against each other. We were saying that speaking English, having a college degree, assimilating were the markers of a model minority, and thus people deserved immigration status because of those qualifications. We were perpetuating the notions that immigrants had to be extraordinary and that they needed to be doctors or lawyers, or the complete opposite of that, doing the dirty work that no one else wanted in order to be valued. It took almost 7 years for me to realize that I had caused harm, that I was pitting immigrant communities against communities facing the criminal justice system. And this is silly, actually, because in Michigan, detention centers are county jails, which means that the same people and same corporations, same systems, are benefiting from incarcerating both brown and black people. I've been slowly trying to repair the harm in my everyday life, but it's painful. Causing harm and repairing harm are both painful things to do. So I thought about myself, and I wondered, am I an ally? Am I an ally to folks who are incarcerated, who are part of the LGBT community, to people who are homeless? The short answer is yes, but that's not enough, at least not in the way I had experienced allyhood in the past. It's not enough for me to post on Facebook how angry I am, although sometimes it's helpful. And it's also not enough to say that I'm an ally without actually doing more. I'm a racial justice practitioner, and we often say, it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. Let me explain what I mean. I volunteer closely with an organization called the Washtenaw Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Rights, also known as WICR because it's such a long name. We often get volunteers who email us wanting to do the traditional type of volunteering work. What sort of paperwork can I sort? Can I organize a clothing drive? And while I truly appreciate these efforts, because that was me once, that's not solidarity. Solidarity is about recognizing our own humanity and standing together even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable, and when there's a shared risk. And this shared risk doesn't have to mean that you're in danger of being arrested or being deported. The shared risk is in losing our humanity. Let's face it, our field of social work is pretty white and thus inherently racist. Racism hurts white people as much as it hurts people of color. There is violence in a whiteness that oppresses people. There is harm in a whiteness that dehumanizes people of color. And harm isn't one-directional. It affects both the person harmed and the person causing the harm. So thinking of ourselves as allies is disconnected from the grand picture. It doesn't allow us to recognize that allies are also being oppressed by the same systems, but in different ways. And this disconnection harms our movements. Our movements are about connection. They're about seeing that we're all impacted by racism, by xenophobia, by sexism. Our humanity is impacted. And unless we see that humanity at stake, unless we see ourselves as co-conspirators in this work, nothing is going to change. It's not about being allies. It's not about simply showing up, although that's a start. It's about actually seeing the urgency that we can no longer function in a world where your struggles aren't my struggles. This is really difficult in a world that's bounded by bureaucracy and systems, and with so many guidelines that mandate how social workers can interact in the world. And I'm not calling for boundaries to be broken. That's hurtful in a different way. I'm calling for us to see that US citizens also have something to lose if undocumented people suffer. Cisgender people also have something to lose if trans rights are erased. Men have something to lose when women are victimized. We lose not only because we have people we love in those identities, but because being complicit to a system that advantages you while at the same time marginalizes someone else does something to our humanness. Have you ever done something wrong and felt completely terrible about it? Now imagine that level of pain and remorse on a global scale. Or worse, imagine that level of pain that goes unnoticed for people who still don't see racism, still don't see sexism. Imagine that pain just quietly sitting in our homes until we see it explode in toxic masculinity, domestic violence, school shootings. How can we get to the point where our movements are about solidarity with our humanity? Where we stop pitting communities against each other? These are the questions that need to be answered. It has taken me a long time to arrive at this moment, to stop calling for allies and instead call for co-conspirators. I want people next to me who are going to have my back, and I will have theirs. I want people next to me who will know what to do if I'm being deported. I want social workers like the ones in Flint and Detroit who stood with the conflict of calling CPS when finding out that a child's home had no water, because they recognized that water shutoffs were a result of white supremacy, that it wasn't the parents were being careless. I want social workers that demand that their coworkers stop using the I word and aren't asking people for immigration status because it's not relevant. I want social workers who are calling their elected officials, who are marching in the streets, who are running for office because enough is enough. This is our role as social workers and as people, to care so deeply about the people in Flint, in Kalamazoo, in the Upper Peninsula, in Detroit, that we are scared at how much we can love and how much power we have not only to resist, but to envision. The role of social workers who traditionally see themselves as allies is to envision and work for a world in which allies are no longer needed. Let's envision a world where undocumented people are safe, free, able to travel, see our families, vote, and work in a job that fulfill us. Then let's sit together and talk about how to make that real for everyone, not just undocumented people. Let's talk about how to change policies, laws, and changing who's in office. Friends, I'm not naive. I know that this will not happen within our lifetimes. I have seen too many people be deported to believe that somehow in the next few years, all will be well. But we have to start somewhere. And for me, that starts with envisioning and building strong, authentic relationships. In my job with We the People Michigan, I work on building multiracial statewide alliances across the state. I organize people of color and low-income folks, white folks, to build a proactive agenda for what we want and what we deserve in Michigan. It's one of the hardest roles I've ever had. Organizing across race is incredibly hard. Yet, we believe this work is necessary. If we are to end racism, it will be with the collaboration of white folks who are willing to lose power and status in order to create equity. If we are to end economic disparity, it will mean a rebalance of power and wealth in the United States. This is scary to many people. Changing the status quo is difficult, dangerous, and slow. Yeah, we keep doing it because like for many of you, the alternative is even more difficult. The alternative is people dying in the streets, freezing in the cold, dying as they're crossing the desert. Doing nothing is not an option. And no one exemplifies the choice to keep going more than a good friend of mine, who volunteers closely with Wicker. And she would be mortified if I actually said her name, so I won't. On Tuesday morning, as she was driving a young undocumented man to court, she was pulled over by ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. They were being followed. ICE was surveilling this young person and chose to detain him while he was on his way to court. My friend, who is a U.S. citizen, had to watch this young person arrested and detained in front of her. We in Wicker knew a day like this was coming. We knew it was only a matter of time before our own volunteers were going to be stopped for helping someone who's undocumented. And my friend, as this was happening, stood there, witnessing state violence, asking this young person what he needed at that moment. His only request was to let his mom know that he had been detained. So my friend did. She drove to his house and she left a note for his mom because we didn't have her phone number. And all I can picture is my friend in an empty house writing a note saying, "Your son has been detained by immigration. We don't know where he is." What a painful and tragic thing to witness. What an even more painful thing to lose someone to the immigration system. Yet, our liberation is in these moments of pain when we choose to keep going, even though there's an ICE officer in your face questioning why you're giving someone a ride to court. In the moments when we go home and cry and hold each other, knowing full well that we'll go back out there tomorrow. Lourdes Salazar, the woman who called me last year asking for help, was ultimately deported. But the movement continues because we are the movement. And we as social workers are tasked with the incredible responsibility to take care of our clients, our students, our patients, each other. We show up every day ready to be co-conspirators in this work because so much is at stake. Our humanity is at stake. And that is the only thing that matters. Thank you. believe we have a little bit of time for some questions. I'm not sure if there's a microphone for the crowd, or maybe you just have to speak really loudly. Alan, over here.
Her question is, her voice is going out from today's festivities. What was the reasoning for your father coming to America? Like, did you guys have other family here, or did he just come by himself?
Yeah. So my dad's family, his brother and his aunt lived in Detroit. I'm not actually sure why my uncle moved to the U.S., but I know that in Mexico, my dad worked as a carpenter, and there was never enough money, never enough resources. And because his brother was already living here, that was an opportunity for my dad to come to the U.S. And the plan had always been that he would come, stay here for a few years, work, and send money back. But that reality is actually very difficult. How much money can you realistically save in 3 years to be able to survive the rest of your life? Yeah. So we ended up in Detroit, out of all places, which is strange.
I want to co-conspire with you. So how can we, if any of us would like to do that, how can we do that?
Yeah, so there is, so the question and the statement was, how can we co-conspire? I would say the first thing to think about is, what can't you stop doing? I found myself doing immigration because it was something that I just couldn't stay away from. And as we're thinking about how to support undocumented people, how to be co-conspirators in this work, thinking what kind of work can we do in our communities to support undocumented people there. And if we live in communities where there isn't a lot of support, well, how can we get involved in a more local or national level? So two really important issues that are happening right now on a national level with immigration is that there's an agreement called the Flores Agreement that was set in place by the Obama administration that term limited how long children could be detained in a detention center. And right now, the Trump administration introduced policies to basically end the Flores Agreement, which would then mean that undocumented children could be detained inside detention centers indefinitely. That's currently happening right now. There is a time period where regular people can go and comment and show their dissent to this change in this national legislation. And I would be happy to share those resources with Alan about how everyone can go and post a comment, and these comments all have to be reviewed. And for people to say, I'm actually against this, I think undocumented children, I think it's wrong for undocumented children, for any children, to be detained indefinitely. So that's one. The second large one, I'm not sure if anyone have you heard about this issue of public charge, which is really confusing and not at all exciting. And that's how these policies get you, is that they're really complicated and you can never explain it to someone fast enough so they're actually with you on the same page. So public charge is an existing law that says that someone immigrating into the US can't be a public charge to the US government. They can't depend on someone else to provide for them. They have to be able to take care of themselves. And so there's a change to that legislation. So before, even if you if your children were receiving, let's say, Medicaid, if your children were receiving WIC, if they were U.S. citizens, that was okay. It didn't matter. They were not considered a public charge because these were understood to be services that were important for U.S. citizens. Now what they're trying to do is they're trying to shift that. So if your children are U.S. citizens and you're undocumented, whenever you try to change your status, they're going to say you are a public charge because your U.S. citizen children use this resource, and now you're not eligible to become a U.S. citizen because you use this resource and because you're a public charge. So what we need is for people, the same thing, to go and to comment on this federal website to say, like, I'm actually against this. I don't think public charge should go through. And again, I'm happy to share those with Alan. So those are two specific. I would love to have a conversation with anyone afterwards about what specifically can you do at a more local level.
Can I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
So on the Flores statement, the NASW Michigan and the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center are writing a statement jointly in opposition to the indefinite detention of children. I mean, as social workers, we know that that is not healthy for children. We know ACEs, we know all of that stuff. So we are working with them. That comment should be submitted in a few days here. For the public charge, our national office is working on submitting comments in opposition to changing that definition of public charge. And then there's another issue that's happening with the agreement now that's in place between ICE and the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, where information that ORR, which is the organization within the Health and Human Services that oversees the detention of children while they're waiting to be placed with sponsor families. There is now an agreement that any information collected by social workers when they're going out to screen sponsor families, which includes immigration status, that information now has to be shared, and it gets shared with ICE, and then those families get deported if they don't have the proper documentation. And so NASW is working, Michigan is working with the organization that places those children and the social workers that are involved in doing this to find a way to stop from them having to share this information. So I just wanted to add that. We have.
Thank you.
Oh, did you want to piggyback on that? Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we'll get that information out to folks to where you can also contribute to those comments. There is a question in the back first, and then we have a gentleman in the front.
Hello? Okay, good. Hi, so I'm a first-generation Filipino-American, and everything you've been saying and doing is really inspiring to me. So I just, that term co-conspirator, also a really cool term. Sorry, losing my train of thought. So as an immigrant, my parents immigrated legally, and I know that a lot of other immigrant communities in the U.S., I've heard like they have some sort of disdain for undocumented legal immigrants because they didn't come here legally through the process. What would you say to those communities, to those people who have that mindset that just because they didn't come here through legal means that they shouldn't be allowed to be in here?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, that's actually very common, and it's a perfect example of how we pit immigrant communities and communities of color against each other. So one of the legal response to that is that there is no way for many undocumented people to fix their status. There's no way for them to apply to come into the U.S., and if there is a way, it will take decades. So, for example, my dad, his brother is a U.S. citizen. My dad doesn't have anyone else who's a U.S. citizen. I'm not a citizen, my mom's not a citizen, my brother's not a citizen. So you have to have that initial sponsor who's able to bring you into the U.S. legally. His only hook into the system is his brother. My dad applied for status in 2001, and we're still waiting. and his application will probably take about 5 more years. And even if his application is reviewed and it's approved, because my dad has been without any kind of immigration status in the U.S. for more than a year, he would have to go back to Mexico as a punishment. They call it a ban. He would have to go back to Mexico and wait out 10 years as a punishment. And then there's still no guarantee that he would be let back into the United States. So what I would say is that people who came here legally are really lucky and very privileged, and to recognize that that doesn't happen for most people. If you are trying to feed your children, if you're escaping violence, if you're receiving death threats, you're not going to submit an application and wait 15 years to see what happens. You are going to do what's best for your kids. So that's the answer, is that it takes a really long time. It's really complicated, and it depends on having a U.S. citizen link here in the U.S., or it depends on you being able to have a refugee case that's approved outside of the United States. But even that takes a really long time. It takes years of vetting to be able to come into the U.S. Most people don't have that luxury of waiting. Thanks.
Hello. I was really glad to hear you express your comments about how you felt about the inequality in this country. And I was wondering, for one, what you went through, how did that enlighten you to the fact of the powers that be has to give up some in order to let the lower class move up? And what would you say to them? Because I've heard comments as, we got ours like this and you got to get yours the best way you can. And then they tell these about we made the sweat of our back, when they really didn't. They used slaves and everybody else to get the money they got. But how do you fight back on the pushback that you're going to receive?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. For me, it started primarily with having an analysis and a conversation about race. And sometimes I feel like a broken record, because all the issues in my life, I can trace them back to the root cause of this is white supremacy and race. And investing in yourselves, in your organizations, in your workplaces, and having anti-racism trainings is one of the first steps that I have found worked for me, for the people in my life. Because you're right, people keep saying, this idea of pull yourself by your bootstraps, that if I did it, why can't you? If my ancestors came the right way, why can't yours? It's like, well, actually, your ancestors came and raped and killed people. That doesn't seem like the right way. So going back to race and anti-racism and trainings on anti-racism has, for me, has been the most useful. And even then, I've been in training spaces where we do anti-racism workshops, and there are people who are very resistant, and there's pain and there's tears, because it's painful to confront your own white supremacy. There's a lot of hate, there's a lot of trauma that's embedded in it. And I think something that we don't often name is that white supremacy also damages and hurts and oppresses white people. And unless we can actually have a conversation about how to shift power, and that shifting power is going to be a very painful, could be a very violent thing. Are we ready for those level of conversations? So for me, what I see social workers doing is not only working on these policy changes, but also how do we change our culture? How do we start changing our culture in work, in schools, internally, in our families, so we can have conversations about race that don't end in tears.
Is this on? Okay. I just wanted to add that I did put, if you want to comment on the indefinite detention, I put the link for that on the conference app in the activity feed. So you can just go right there, and you can either email it directly, or there's a link you can follow. The instructions are a little jumbled there, but you'll be able to figure it out. And if you can't, just get a hold of us at the Michigan office.
Any last questions? Yes. In the back.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much. Your presentation moved myself, and I hope it moved a lot of people in this room for action. My question is, I'm a student at Michigan State University. How can we get you on our campus? Because we need the fire. We need the advocacy. My main goal is to go into clinical, but I'm also a fighter, and I'm fighting for the marginalized. And sometimes in our society, in our communities, we need forums like this so that we can talk about sensitive issues and so that we can be more aware, because especially with the millennials that are coming up, they need to understand that this is not a black and white issue. This is a humanitarian issue. So how can we get this? Because this room right here is the future of the advocacy for what you're fighting for. So how can we get your organization in every campus that's in this room?
Thank you. I would love to I do work on a state level wide. We have organizers through all of Michigan. We're actually really excited because one of our organizers is in the UP, and she's doing a voter engagement campaign for the first time in the Upper Peninsula, and people that are incredibly excited and engaged. Short answer is I would love to work with you. The longer answer is that I think you're the fire. You're the fire that your community and your campus needs. We have the resources in our own communities that we need. We often think about how, if we only had enough money, if we only had this person, if we only had enough lobbyists to be doing this and that. We have to reshift that and recognize that we have what we need within our own communities and start cultivating those relationships, that leadership within your own campus to be able to build these kind of movements that don't depend on anyone else but your own community. Well, if there are no more questions to close, I just want to say how grateful and excited I am to be here. Since I've been doing community organizing, I don't spend time with a lot of social workers, so it's really great to be in a space with people who, similar to that training that I went to when I was 19, who get it, who understand, who know what this is about, and feel a personal responsibility and commitment to this work. I would want to close with just a mantra that I say to myself often as I'm doing this kind of work. And for me, community organizing and community building is always focused on community and love. We don't often talk about love in our movements. We don't talk about love in our work as social workers. But what would it look like if we were building movements that are rooted in love instead of a struggle? What would it look like if we were building movements that are rooted in community and building authentic relationships? And what makes most sense in a time of uncertainty is to reach out and to be building those relationships. So thank you.